The fluorescent lights of Rosie's diner buzzed with that electrical hum that never quite went away. No matter how many times Danny the maintenance guy claimed he'd fixed them, Maya Rodriguez wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning, her red uniform already showing coffee stains from the early rush, and she hadn't even made it to 7 a.m. yet. The pre-dawn crowd was always the worst, full of grumpy construction workers who wanted their eggs exactly right, and truckers who'd been driving all night and had no patience for anything that took longer than 5 minutes. She'd been working at Rosie's for 3 years now, ever since she'd dropped out of community college when her mum got sick, and every single day felt like it stretched on forever while somehow the weeks blurred together into nothing. Her feet ached in the cheap non-slip shoes she'd bought from the discount store. Her lower back sent sharp reminders that standing for 8 hours straight wasn't what the human body was designed for, and her hands were perpetually dry and cracked from washing dishes during the slow periods because Frank the dishwasher kept calling in sick. The bell above the door chimed, and Maya looked up to see him shuffle in, the man she'd privately nicknamed Tuesday, because he came in every Tuesday morning at exactly 5:45 a.m. without fail. He wore the same tattered brown coat that had seen better days, probably a decade ago, boots that were held together more by duct tape than leather at this point, and a wool hat that he never took off even when he sat down at his usual spot at the far end of the counter. His face was weathered and lined like a roadmap of hard years, with a salt and pepper beard that hadn't seen a trim in months, and his hands were rough and calloused, the kind of hands that had done real work at some point in his life. Maya grabbed the coffee pot and made her way over to him, not bothering with the fake cheerfulness she forced for the other customers, because something about Tuesday had always made her feel like she could just be herself. He never complained, never asked for anything complicated, never made crude jokes or stared at her chest like some of the regulars did, and he always left exactly $3 on the counter, which covered his coffee and toast with a decent tip. She poured his coffee without asking, the dark liquid steaming in the chipped white mug, and slid it across to him with practiced efficiency. He looked up at her with eyes that were surprisingly clear and sharp despite his appearance, a pale gray that reminded her of storm clouds, and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Most people looked right through homeless folks like they were invisible, like they were part of the furniture or just unfortunate decorations on the street, but Maya had never been able to do that, probably because she'd been close enough to that edge herself more times than she wanted to count. Her apartment was a studio in the worst part of town where the sirens were background music and the landlord hadn't fixed the heating in 2 winters. Her car was held together with prayers and determination, and her bank account usually hovered somewhere between empty and overdrawn. She understood what it meant to be one bad break away from disaster. "The usual?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer, and he nodded again without speaking, which was how most of their interactions went. Maya put in the order for wheat toast, no butter, and went back to wiping down the counter while keeping an eye on the other customers. The morning rush would hit in about 15 minutes when the office workers started trickling in for their complicated coffee orders and breakfast sandwiches they'd eat in their cars while sitting in traffic, and she needed to be ready for the chaos that would follow. Tuesday sat there quiet, warming his hands on the coffee mug, staring out the rain-streaked window at the empty street beyond, and Maya found herself wondering, not for the first time, what his story was, where he'd come from, whether he had family somewhere who missed him, or if he was completely alone in the world. When his toast popped up, she buttered it lightly despite his usual request, knowing he needed the calories even if he was too proud or too particular to ask for it, and set the plate down in front of him with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who'd seen her dealing with the rude customers earlier. He looked at the buttered toast, then up at her, and for just a second something flickered across his face, something that might have been gratitude or recognition, or maybe just acknowledgement that she'd seen him, really seen him, not just as a homeless man taking up space but as an actual human being who deserved basic kindness. The moment passed quickly, and he turned his attention to his breakfast while Maya moved on to refill coffee for the trucker in booth 3 who was already getting impatient. 3 months passed in that strange way. Time moves when you're stuck in a routine, where individual days are distinct but weeks blur together into an indistinguishable mass of repetition. Tuesday kept coming in every Tuesday morning, always at 5:45 a.m., always ordering coffee and toast, always leaving $3 on the counter, and gradually Maya started to notice small things about him, that didn't quite fit the homeless stereotype most people would have slapped on him without a second thought. His hands were clean, despite his worn appearance, scrubbed carefully before every meal like he'd been taught proper manners somewhere along the way. He read the newspaper when someone left one behind, but not just the sports or comics section. He went straight for the business pages and the international news, moving his finger along the lines of text with the careful attention of someone who actually understood what compound interest rates and trade agreements meant. One morning in late October, when the diner was unusually quiet, Maya found herself actually talking to him beyond the usual transactional exchange of order and payment. She'd just gotten off the phone with the hospital billing department, another conversation about payment plans she couldn't afford for her mother's treatments, and she must have looked upset because when she brought Tuesday his coffee, he spoke for the first time in all the months she'd been serving him. Rough day. His voice was surprisingly refined, not the rough rasp she'd expected, but cultured, educated, with precise enunciation that suggested years of practice speaking clearly. Maya laughed, but it came out bitter and tired. Rough year, more like it, but yeah, rough day works too. She shouldn't have said anything, shouldn't have opened that door, but something about the genuine concern in his grey eyes made her defenses crack just a little. He nodded slowly, sipping his coffee, and then said something that would stick with her for a long time afterward. The hardest thing about difficult times isn't the circumstances themselves, it's the way they make you forget what's possible. Maya blinked at him, thrown off by the philosophical observation from a man she'd assumed had more immediate concerns, like where he'd sleep that night, or how he'd stay warm when winter really hit. Before she could respond, the morning rush started, and she got pulled back into the chaos of orders and refills and customers complaining about eggs being too runny or toast being too dark. But that small exchange opened something between them, created a crack in the wall of polite distance that existed between server and customer. The next Tuesday, when Maya brought his coffee, she asked him where he was from, and he smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face into something almost young for just a moment. Originally, Boston, been a lot of places since then. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew longer, happened more naturally, usually during the lulls between rushes when the diner was mostly empty, except for the regulars who were too absorbed in their own routines to pay attention to anyone else. Maya learned that his name was actually James, that he'd served in the Navy decades ago, that he could quote Shakespeare and Yeats from memory, and that he had opinions on everything from architecture to the way cities were designed to the proper way to make coffee, which apparently wasn't the way Rosie's had been making it for 40 years. She told him about her mother's illness, about dropping out of school, about her dreams of maybe going back someday and finishing her degree in social work, dreams that felt increasingly impossible with every passing month of barely scraping by. James listened with the kind of attention that had become rare in Maya's life, where most people were just waiting for their turn to talk rather than actually hearing what you were saying. He asked questions that showed he remembered details from previous conversations, and he never offered the kind of empty reassurances that well-meaning people usually gave, the everything happens for a reason, or it'll all work out platitudes that made her want to scream. One rainy Tuesday in November, the diner was almost empty except for them, and Maya did something she'd never done before during a shift. She sat down across from James in his usual spot and just talked to him like a real person rather than a customer. Frank could handle the one other table for 10 minutes. They talked about everything and nothing, about the books they'd read, and the places they wished they could travel, and the way the city had changed over the years. James had a way of seeing beauty in ordinary things, pointing out how the rain made patterns on the window that looked like abstract art, or how the neon sign from the convenience store across the street cast colored shadows that shifted and changed throughout the night. Maya found herself laughing for the first time in weeks, really laughing, not the polite chuckle she gave customers but genuine amusement at a story James told about getting lost in Tokyo because he'd trusted a map that turned out to be printed backward. When her break ended and she had to get back to work, James looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read and said, "You're going to do great things someday, Maya. You have something special that this place can't contain forever." She brushed off the compliment with a self-deprecating joke, but later that night when she was lying in her apartment staring at the water-stained ceiling, she found herself thinking about those words and feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, a tiny flicker of hope that maybe he was wrong. The first Tuesday James didn't show up, Maya tried not to think too much about it. People missed their routine sometimes, got sick, had other things to deal with, and besides she barely knew him really. Just a few months of brief conversations and coffee poured at 5:45 a.m. every week. But by 6:15, when he still hadn't appeared, she found herself glancing at the door every time the bell chimed, feeling an unfamiliar anxiety settle in her chest. She'd already poured his coffee at 5:44 a.m. out of habit, and now it sat there cooling at his usual spot, a small monument to disrupted routine. The other regulars didn't notice, too absorbed in their own breakfast and newspapers and early morning conversations, but Maya couldn't shake the worry that had started gnawing at her. Where did he even go after leaving the diner? She'd never asked, never thought to ask, and now the question felt urgent and important in a way she couldn't quite explain. Tommy, the line cook, noticed her distraction and called out from the kitchen, "You waiting for your boyfriend?" with the kind of teasing that would normally have gotten an eye roll and a middle finger. But today Maya just shrugged and said, "He's not my boyfriend, he's just a regular who didn't show up." Tommy laughed and went back to flipping eggs, and Maya went back to her work, trying to push down the concern that kept bubbling up. The second Tuesday came and went without James, and by then Maya's worry had transformed into something closer to fear. She found herself asking other regulars if they'd seen an older man matching James's description, hanging around the neighborhood, sleeping in any of the usual spots where homeless folks congregated for safety in numbers. Nobody had seen anyone fitting his description, or if they had, they hadn't paid enough attention to remember. The invisibility of homelessness worked both ways. It protected people from unwanted attention, but it also meant they could disappear without anyone noticing or caring. Maya started taking different routes home from her shifts, walking past the shelter 3 blocks over, checking the parks where she sometimes saw people sleeping on benches, scanning faces in crowds with an intensity that probably looked strange to anyone paying attention. She called the local hospitals on her break, giving vague descriptions and hoping someone would know something. But the administrative staff were practiced at giving nothing away, citing privacy laws and suggesting she try the police if she was really concerned about a missing person. The police, when she finally worked up the nerve to call their non-emergency line, were polite but ultimately unhelpful, explaining that adults had the right to go wherever they wanted, and unless there was evidence of foul play or cognitive impairment, there wasn't much they could do about someone who simply stopped showing up to a diner. By the third Tuesday, Maya had started bargaining with the universe in that desperate way people do when they're trying to maintain hope against mounting evidence. Maybe James had gotten a job somewhere and couldn't make his Tuesday morning routine anymore. Maybe he'd reconnected with family who took him in. Maybe he'd found a better situation and didn't need the diner anymore. All possibilities that should have made her happy if they were true, but somehow just made her feel worse because they meant she might never see him again or know what happened. She kept his spot at the counter unofficially reserved, subtly steering other customers to different seats, and she poured his coffee every Tuesday morning even though it just ended up getting cold and dumped down the sink. The other staff thought she was being weird about it, but they humored her because Maya had been there longer than most of them and had earned a certain amount of latitude for her quirk. Christmas came and went in a blur of forced cheer and double shifts for holiday pay, and Maya spent her days off walking through the city looking for James, checking soup kitchens and shelters and the areas under bridges where makeshift camps sometimes formed. She saw dozens of men who could have been him from a distance, that same weathered look and tattered clothing, but when she got closer it was always someone else. Someone with different eyes or a different bearing, and she'd feel both relieved and disappointed in equal measure. Her co-workers stopped asking about the regular who didn't show up anymore, and even Tommy stopped making jokes after he saw Maya's face the one time he suggested maybe she should let it go. The thing that haunted her most wasn't just that James had disappeared, it was the realization of how easy it was for someone to vanish completely when they existed on society's margins, how the systems that were supposed to catch people when they fell were so full of holes that someone could slip through without leaving a trace. She thought about all their conversations, about the intelligence and kindness and hidden depths she'd glimpsed in those early morning talks, and she wondered how many other people walked past James every day without seeing any of that, without seeing him at all really. The guilt started creeping in around February, guilt that she hadn't done more when he was there, hadn't asked the right questions or offered more substantial help than buttered toast and conversation. Guilt that she'd been so absorbed in her own problems that she'd treated their connection as something casual rather than recognizing it for what it might have been, a lifeline for both of them in different ways. March brought warmer weather and the kind of tourists who stopped in the diner looking for authentic local experience while complaining about everything being too greasy or too slow or not matching whatever fantasy they'd built up in their heads. Maya moved through her shifts on autopilot, pouring coffee and taking orders and forcing smiles that never reached her eyes, and she'd stopped pouring James's coffee on Tuesday mornings because even she had to admit that after 4 months, he probably wasn't coming back. The acceptance of that fact hurt in a way she hadn't expected, a dull ache that settled somewhere behind her ribs and refused to go away. She was working the lunch shift on a Thursday, juggling orders for 3 different tables while Frank had another one of his mysterious bathroom breaks that always lasted exactly as long as a cigarette took to smoke, when she noticed him, a man sitting alone in booth 7, and something about him made her look twice. Made her actually focus on his features instead of just registering another customer who needed service. He was older, probably in his 60s, with silver hair that was professionally styled and swept back from his face, wearing a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 3 months, and watching her with an intensity that should have been creepy but somehow wasn't. His face was clean-shaven and his hands were manicured. Everything about him screamed money and power, and the kind of life that existed in a completely different universe from Rosie's diner, yet here he sat in a cracked vinyl booth that had been repaired with duct tape, looking completely out of place, but also completely comfortable. Maya grabbed a menu and headed over to his table, her professional smile sliding into place automatically. "Welcome to Rosie's, can I get you started with some coffee?" She was already reaching for the pot she'd grabbed on her way over, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Actually, I'm here to talk to you, Maya, if you have a few minutes." The use of her name made her freeze, her mind immediately jumping to all the worst-case scenarios: debt collectors who'd tracked her down at work, lawyers with bad news about her mother's medical bills, some kind of scam artist who'd researched her beforehand. Her guard went up instantly, and she took a small step back. "Do I know you?" The man smiled, and something about that smile tugged at her memory. Something familiar in the warmth of it despite his unfamiliar face. "Not exactly, but I know you, or rather I know about you from someone who thinks very highly of you." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Please, sit down, this won't take long and I promise I'm not here to cause you any trouble." Maya glanced around the diner, noting that most tables were finishing up their meals and Tommy could cover for a few minutes if needed. Against her better judgment, she slid into the booth across from the stranger, keeping her posture tense and ready to bolt if this conversation went sideways. "Who are you?" The man reached into his briefcase, a sleek leather thing that probably cost more than her rent, and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table between them. "My name is Richard Thornton. I'm an attorney with Thornton and Associates, and I'm here on behalf of James Michael Cunningham." The name hit Maya like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her Tuesday regular, the homeless man she'd been worried about for months, searching for without success. "You know James, is he okay? Where is he?" The questions tumbled out before she could stop them, desperation and relief and confusion all mixing together. Richard's expression softened, became almost paternal. "He's fine, better than fine actually, and he wanted me to give you this." He slid the folder across the table to her. "Before you open it, I need to explain some things about James, about who he really is." Maya's hands were shaking as she reached for the folder but didn't open it yet. Her attention locked on Richard's face. "James Cunningham is one of the wealthiest men in the Pacific Northwest, with a net worth in the hundreds of millions," Richard said, his tone matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather, rather than information that made absolutely no sense. "He made his fortune in real estate development and technology investments, retired 15 years ago, and has spent the time since then living periodically as a homeless person, to understand poverty from the inside, to see how society actually treats its most vulnerable members." Maya's brain felt like it was short-circuiting, trying to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew. "That's insane. Why would anyone do that?" Richard leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "Because James came from nothing himself, grew up in foster care, was homeless as a young man, before he managed to turn things around, and he never forgot what that felt like. He never forgot the people who helped him when he had nothing to offer in return, and he wanted to understand if things had gotten better or worse since his own experience decades ago. He paused, letting that sink in. He also wanted to find genuinely good people, people who were kind without any expectation of reward or recognition, people who saw humanity in others regardless of circumstances. Maya felt tears pricking at her eyes without fully understanding why. The coffee and toast, the conversations, all of that was just some kind of test. The bitterness in her voice surprised her, but Richard shook his head quickly. No, not a test, never a test. James doesn't think in those terms. He was genuinely homeless during those months, living on the streets, experiencing everything that entails. The kindness you showed him wasn't part of some experiment or game. It was real and it mattered to him more than you know. Maya opened the folder with trembling hands, her vision blurring with tears she was trying desperately to keep from falling. Inside were legal documents, official-looking papers with letterhead from law firms and financial institutions, and on top of everything was a handwritten letter in elegant script that she somehow knew was James's handwriting before she even started reading. The letter began simply, "Dear Maya, if you're reading this, then Richard has found you and told you the truth about who I am, and I hope you can forgive the deception, though I never lied to you about anything that mattered. Every conversation we had was real. Every moment of kindness you showed me came from your genuine heart, and that's precisely why I'm writing this letter." Maya's hands shook harder, making the paper rattle, and Richard quietly pushed a box of tissues across the table to her. She grabbed one without looking up, wiping her eyes while continuing to read. "In the months I spent living on the streets this time, I encountered hundreds of people, and most looked through me like I was invisible. Some were actively cruel, treating me as less than human because of my appearance and circumstances. But you, Maya, you saw me as a person, you showed me kindness, without any expectation of return. You gave me buttered toast even when I said I didn't want butter because you knew I needed the calorie. You sat with me during your break and talked to me like I mattered, like my thoughts and opinions had value. You have no idea how rare that is, how precious." The letter went on, James's words describing his observations of her character, her dedication to her sick mother despite crushing financial pressure, her kindness to other struggling customers at the diner, the way she worked double shifts without complaint, and still found energy to be gentle with people who were having bad days. Reading about herself through his eyes was almost painful, because Maya had never thought of her actions as anything special, just basic human decency that anyone should show anyone else. But James saw it differently, saw it as extraordinary in a world where most people were too absorbed in their own lives to notice others suffering. "I left without saying goodbye because I needed medical treatment that I couldn't explain while maintaining my circumstances, and because I wanted to do something for you that required legal preparations," the letter continued, and Maya felt her heart rate accelerating. "You once told me about your dream of finishing your degree in social work, of helping people who fell through the cracks like your mother did, like I appeared to be doing. I want to help make that dream a reality." The next paragraph made Maya stop breathing entirely. "I've established a trust fund in your name, containing $1 million. The documents in this folder outline how it works, but the summary is this: your mother's medical bills will be paid in full. You'll receive a monthly living stipend that will allow you to quit the diner and return to school full-time, and upon completion of your degree, you'll receive the remaining funds to use however you see fit, whether that's starting your own non-profit, continuing your education, or simply securing your financial future. There are no strings attached, no expectations beyond hoping you'll use this opportunity to become the person I know you're capable of being." Maya couldn't see the words anymore through her tears, couldn't process what she was reading. $1 million was an amount of money so far beyond her reality that it felt fictional, like she was reading a story about someone else's life. She looked up at Richard, searching his face for signs this was a joke or a scam or some kind of terrible mistake. "This can't be real. People don't just do things like this. Not for waitresses they barely know." Richard's smile was gentle and knowing. "James has done exactly this for 17 people over the years. Individuals who showed him genuine kindness during his times living homeless. He believes that good people trapped in difficult circumstances should have the chance to escape those circumstances and help others in turn. He calls it paying forward the help he received when he was young." He tapped the fold. "This is completely real, completely legal, and completely yours if you want it. There's no catch, no hidden requirements. James doesn't want gratitude or recognition or anything in return. He just wants you to have the chance you deserve. Maya felt like the diner was spinning around her, like reality had become untethered from anything solid or predictable. Why me? What did I do that was so special? Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. You treated a man you thought was homeless with dignity and respect. You showed kindness without any possibility of reward. You saw past circumstances to the human being underneath, and you did it consistently over months without ever asking for anything in return. In James's experience, that kind of character is incredibly rare and worth investing in. The weight of it all crashed over Maya suddenly. The months of worry about James, the relief that he was alive and safe, the shock of discovering who he really was, and now this impossible gift that would change everything about her life. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, not delicate tears but full-body heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, releasing months of stress and fear and exhaustion all at once. Richard sat quietly, letting her cry, and when she finally looked up again, her face blotchy and her eyes swollen, he handed her another tissue and said, "James wanted me to tell you something else. He said to tell you that you were right. You are going to do great things, and now you'll have the chance to prove." Maya sat in her apartment that night, surrounded by paperwork, legal documents spread across her small kitchen table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others, and she'd never gotten around to fixing it properly. The pages outlined trusts and transfers and financial instruments she barely understood, despite Richard spending 2 hours explaining everything to her after her breakdown in the diner. $1 million. The number kept circling in her head, refusing to feel real no matter how many times she looked at the bank statements Richard had shown her, proof that the money existed, that this wasn't some elaborate scam or fever dream. She picked up her phone a dozen times, wanting to call someone to share this insane news. But who would she call? Her mother was asleep at the nursing facility, heavily medicated and barely lucid on her good days, and Maya had learned the hard way that giving her mother good news just made the bad days worse when she couldn't remember the good things anymore. Her co-workers at the diner were friendly enough, but not real friends, not people she could trust with something this big, and she'd lost touch with most of her college friends when she'd dropped out 3 years ago, too ashamed of her circumstances to maintain those connections. The isolation of her situation hit her suddenly, the realization that she'd been so focused on survival that she'd stopped building any kind of real life beyond work and worry. The trust documents outlined stipulations that were surprisingly minimal given the amount of money involved. Her mother's medical bills would be paid immediately. That part was straightforward and would happen regardless of what Maya decided about the rest. The monthly stipend would begin as soon as she enrolled in classes, enough to cover rent, food, books and basic living expenses without requiring her to work full-time. The remainder of the trust would be released upon completion of her bachelor's degree, or after 5 years, whichever came first, and even if she never finished school, she'd still receive the money, though James's letter had made it clear he hoped she'd use the opportunity to pursue her education. There was no requirement to pay anything back, no expectation that she'd name buildings after James, or publicly credit him. In fact, the documents specifically stated that the source of the funds was to remain confidential, known only to Maya, Richard and James himself. Maya got up from the table and walked to her window, looking out over the city lights that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Somewhere out there, James was living his real life, probably in some mansion or penthouse surrounded by comfort and security, while she'd been worrying about him freezing to death on the street. The thought should have made her angry, should have felt like betrayal, but somehow it didn't, because the James she'd known at the diner had been real even if his circumstances were manufactured. The conversations they'd had, the connection she'd felt, that hadn't been fake. Richard had assured her of that, and Maya chose to believe him because the alternative was too painful to consider. The practical part of her brain, the part that had kept her functioning through 3 years of barely scraping by, started making calculations. With her mother's bills paid, she could quit one of her jobs immediately, maybe keep the diner shifts part-time for structure, and because she actually liked some aspects of it, or maybe leave completely and focus entirely on school. She could move to a better apartment, somewhere with heat that actually worked and neighbors who didn't scream at each other at 2 a.m., maybe even a place with a real bedroom instead of a studio where her bed and kitchen existed in the same room. She could buy new clothes, not from thrift stores but actual new clothes that fit properly, could get her car fixed instead of nursing it along with duct tape and prayer, could eat something other than ramen and diner leftover. The possibilities were dizzying and terrifying in equal measure, because Maya had spent so long in survival mode that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to think about wants instead of just needs. But underneath the practical calculations was something else, something more complex and harder to name. Guilt, maybe, that she was receiving this incredible gift while so many others were still struggling, still working 2 jobs and drowning in debt and watching their dreams disappear under the weight of circumstances beyond their control. Unworthiness, the nagging voice in her head that insisted she hadn't done anything special enough to deserve this, that showing basic human kindness to someone shouldn't result in becoming a millionaire. Fear, because money solved some problems but created others, and Maya had heard enough stories about lottery winners and sudden wealth destroying people's lives to know that having money didn't automatically make everything better. She picked up the letter from James again, reading certain passages for probably the 20th time that evening. Don't let guilt rob you of this opportunity. You earned this through your character, not through luck or manipulation. The world needs more people like you in positions where they can help others, and that's exactly what I'm hoping you'll become. Later that night, lying in bed and staring at her water-stained ceiling for maybe the last time if she decided to move, Maya made her decision. She would accept the gift, not because she thought she deserved it necessarily, but because refusing it wouldn't help anyone and might hurt James, who clearly wanted to do this, wanted to believe his wealth could create positive change beyond just accumulating more wealth. She would return to school and finish her degree, not because the trust required it, but because she'd wanted that for herself before circumstances derailed everything. And she would find a way to pay forward this incredible kindness, not to James directly but to others who needed help, because that's what he'd done for her and that's what she wanted to do for someone else someday. The first day back at community college felt surreal, like Maya was watching someone else's life unfold rather than living her own. She sat in a lecture hall that smelled like new carpet and dry erase markers, surrounded by students who were mostly younger than her but some older, people starting over or continuing education they'd interrupted for life's various emergencies. Professor Martinez was explaining the syllabus for Social Work 301, outlining the theories they'd study and the fieldwork they'd complete, and Maya found herself leaning forward in her seat, actually excited about coursework for the first time since high school. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of changes that still didn't feel entirely real despite living them every single day. Her mother's medical bills had been paid in full within 2 weeks of Maya signing the trust documents, and the relief of that burden lifting had been so overwhelming that Maya had cried in the hospital billing office while the administrator awkwardly patted her shoulder and assured her that yes, the payment had cleared, yes, it covered everything including future treatments for the next 2 years. Her mother's condition hadn't improved, the dementia was progressive and irreversible, but at least now she was in a good facility with attentive staff and Maya could visit without the crushing guilt of knowing she couldn't afford better care. Maya had quit both her jobs, giving 2 weeks' notice at the diner even though she could have just walked out, because years of customer service had ingrained certain courtesies too deeply to abandon. Tommy had thrown her an impromptu goodbye party during the overnight shift, complete with a grocery store cake that said "Good luck, Maya" in slightly smeared blue frosting, and even Frank had gotten misty-eyed when she left, though he'd blamed it on the onions he was chopping. She'd moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood, nothing fancy but clean and warm with windows that actually opened and closed properly, and every morning when she woke up in a real bedroom with a door she could close, she felt grateful in a way that would have seemed ridiculous to someone who'd never lived in a studio where the toilet was 6 feet from where you slept. The monthly stipend was more than enough to cover her expenses, and Maya found herself having to relearn how to live without constant financial stress, having to actively remind herself that she could buy fresh vegetables instead of just whatever was cheapest, that she could get her car repaired properly instead of patching it together. She'd joined a study group for her sociology class, started going to campus events, slowly rebuilt a social life that had atrophied during her years of just working and surviving. For the first time in years, Maya felt like she was moving forward instead of just treading water, felt like she had a future that extended beyond next month's rent and this week's bills. But success brought its own complications, its own strange guilt and discomfort. In her social work class, it discussed poverty and systemic inequality and the ways society failed its most vulnerable members. And Maya would sit there thinking about the $1 million in her trust account and wonder what made her more deserving than the single mothers in her old apartment building or the elderly man she'd seen sorting through trash for recyclable. She'd done nothing revolutionary, shown basic kindness to one person, and somehow that had transformed her entire life, while thousands of others who were equally kind remained trapped in circumstances just as desperate as hers had been. The unfairness of it gnawed at her, made her question whether she should have accepted James's gift, whether she had any right to this opportunity when distribution was so random and arbitrary. She started volunteering at a homeless shelter on weekends, partly for her fieldwork requirements, but mostly because she needed to do something tangible to address the guilt that kept her awake some nights. The shelter was chronically underfunded and overwhelmed, serving 300 people nightly in a facility designed for half that many, and Maya found herself using James's framework, watching how staff and volunteers interacted with the clients, noting who treated them with dignity and who showed subtle contempt or condescension. She thought about James often, wondered what he was doing, whether he was living homeless somewhere again, or enjoying his wealth, whether he thought about her or the other 16 people Richard had mentioned. She'd asked Richard if she could contact James, thank him properly, but Richard had gently explained that James preferred to remain anonymous, that he believed gratitude created uncomfortable dynamics and he wanted his gifts to be truly free without any expectations of relationship or acknowledgement. Maya respected that decision even as it frustrated her because she had so many questions, wanted to understand his motivation more deeply, wanted to know if his experiment had changed his perspective or just confirmed what he already believed. One afternoon in November, almost exactly a year after James had stopped coming to the diner, Maya was studying in the campus library when she noticed an older man shelving books in the reference section. Something about the careful way he handled the volumes, the precise attention he paid to getting them in exact order, reminded her of James, and she found herself watching him for several minutes before returning to her textbook. The man noticed her staring and smiled politely, and Maya smiled back, and in that moment she understood something she hadn't quite grasped before. James wasn't just testing individuals or conducting some elaborate social experiment. He was reminding himself and anyone who learned his story that circumstances didn't define character, that dignity existed independently of bank accounts, that the most profound human connections could happen anywhere between anyone, if people were willing to actually see each other. She thought about all the people she passed every day on campus, on the street, in stores and restaurants, thought about how easy it was to categorize them by surface observations and miss the full human being under the complicated histories and private struggles and hidden depths that everyone carried. Maya finished her first semester with a 3.8 GPA, made the dean's list, and felt pride that was entirely her own rather than based on external validation. She'd worked hard, studied diligently, contributed meaningfully to class discussions, and earned those grades through her own effort. The money had given her opportunity, but what she did with that opportunity was entirely up to her, and that distinction mattered. Maya graduated 3 years later with her bachelor's degree in social work, walked across the stage to receive her diploma while imagining all the people who'd helped her get there, her mother who couldn't attend but had sacrificed so much before getting sick, her professors who'd challenged and encouraged her, and James, the homeless man who wasn't homeless, whose gift had made everything else possible. The remaining trust funds were released the day after graduation, and Maya found herself with more money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to secure her future indefinitely if she was smart about it, enough to make a real difference if she chose to. She'd thought carefully about what to do with the money, consulted with financial advisors Richard had recommended, and made a decision that felt right even though it terrified her. She would start a non-profit organization focused on helping people trapped in poverty access education and job training, providing not just financial assistance but mentorship and support systems that addressed the complicated reality of breaking cycles that had nothing to do with individual merit and everything to do with circumstances beyond anyone's control. She'd rent office space, hire staff, create programs that actually worked instead of just making donors feel good, and she'd do it all in a way that honored James's belief that character mattered more than credentials, that good people deserved chances regardless of where they started. The paperwork for establishing the non-profit was more complicated than anything she'd dealt with in school, requiring lawyers and accountants and endless forms that made her head spin, but Maya pushed through it with the same determination that had gotten her through 3 years of school while volunteering and maintaining her mother's care. 6 months after graduation, Second Chance's Foundation officially opened its doors in a small office downtown, and Maya stood in the empty space feeling both proud and overwhelmed, wondering if she was really capable of running an organization that would affect real people's real lives. The foundation's first year was harder than Maya had anticipated, full of mistakes and learning curves, and moments where she questioned whether she had any idea what she was doing. But gradually they found their rhythm, helped their first scholarship recipients enroll in school, placed their first job training graduates in stable employment, and started seeing the ripple effects that James must have understood when he'd started his own paying forward project decades earlier. Maya thought about him often, wondered if he knew what she'd done with his gift, if he'd be proud or disappointed or indifferent, but she never tried to contact him, respecting the boundary he'd established, even though she desperately wanted to thank him properly, to show him that his faith in her hadn't been misplaced. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late spring when Maya decided to visit Rosie's diner for the first time since quitting 5 years earlier. She'd driven past it hundreds of times but never stopped, partly because she was busy but mostly because returning felt like it might break some spell, might remind her too viscerally of how different her life had been and how easily she could have remained trapped there. But today she felt strong enough to face it, wanted to see Tommy and Frank and maybe leave a ridiculously large tip for whoever was working her old sections. The diner looked exactly the same from outside, same neon sign with the O that flickered, same cracked parking lot, same slightly shabby appearance that had always been more comfortable than depressing. Maya parked her sensible Toyota, the car she'd bought with her stipend money after her old one finally died, and walked toward the entrance with her heart beating faster than the situation warranted. She was reaching for the door handle when she heard her name, spoken in a voice she recognized instantly despite not having heard it in 5 years. Maya. She turned around and there he was, James, but not the James she remembered from the diner. This was James as he actually existed, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than a semester's tuition, his silver hair professionally styled, stepping out of a Rolls-Royce Phantom that gleamed in the late afternoon sun like something from a different reality. He looked healthy and vigorous, younger than she remembered him looking at the diner, and his grey eyes held the same intelligence and warmth she'd recognized all those years ago. Maya's mouth fell open and she couldn't find words, couldn't process the surreal experience of seeing James here now, after years of wondering and imagining and never expecting actual contact. He walked toward her with a slight smile, moving with the confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin regardless of circumstances, and stopped a respectful distance away. "I hope you don't mind me surprising you like this. Richard mentioned you might be here today. Something about anniversaries and closure." Maya found her voice finally, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. "You've been keeping tabs on me." James shook his head quickly. "Richard occasionally mentions your foundation's work because I'm one of your donors, anonymous of course, but I never asked him to track your movements. Today is genuinely coincidental timing combined with good luck." He glanced at the diner behind her. "I was hoping we could talk if you have time. Really talk, not as homeless man and waitress, but as two people who shared something meaningful 5 years ago." They ended up in booth 7, the same booth where Richard had first revealed James's identity, and the middle-aged waitress who took their order looked at James like she couldn't quite figure out why someone wearing a suit that expensive was sitting in Rosie's diner, but she brought their coffee without comment. Maya had so many questions she didn't know where to start, and James seemed content to wait patiently while she organized her thoughts. Finally she asked the question that had bothered her most. "Why me? Out of everyone you met during your months here, what made you choose me?" James considered his response carefully, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug in a gesture so familiar it made Maya's chest tighten. "I've given that kind of help to 17 people over the years, and the answer is different for each one. But for you specifically, it was the day you sat down during your break and just talked to me like I was worth your time, like my opinions mattered. You were exhausted and stressed and dealing with your own crisis, but you still made space for human connection with someone who couldn't offer you anything in return. That kind of character is rare and valuable and worth investing in." He paused. I've been proven right based on what Richard tells me about your foundation. You're helping people the same way I tried to help you, creating opportunities and breaking cycles, exactly what I hoped would happen. They talked for 2 hours, the diner filling and emptying around them while they caught up on 5 years of separate lives. James told her about his other projects and the people he'd helped and his continued periodic experiments living homeless to stay connected with reality. Maya told him about her mother's death the previous year and the grief that still ambushed her at unexpected moments, about the challenges of running a non-profit and the incredible satisfaction of watching people transform their own lives when given proper support. When they finally stepping out into the parking lot as the sun set and painted everything gold and orange, James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and for one confused moment Maya thought he was about to propose, which would have been insane. But instead he opened it to reveal a simple silver ring with an inscription on the inside, for Maya, who saw a person where others saw a problem. Never forget your worth. Maya's eyes filled with tears for about the 100th time since meeting James, and she let him slip the ring onto her right hand while she tried to find adequate words for everything she was feeling. Thank you doesn't seem like enough for changing my entire life. James smiled and shook his head. You changed your own life. I just removed some obstacles. The rest was all you. Your work, your determination, your character. Never forget that. He gestured toward the Rolls Royce. I should let you go, but I wanted you to know that you made a difference to me too. Those mornings at the diner reminded me why I do what I do, why staying connected to struggle matters even when you have the resources to avoid it completely. You restored my faith in people at a time when I badly needed that restoration, so thank you. They hugged awkwardly, the embrace of two people who'd shared something profound but remained essentially stranger. And James got into his Rolls Royce and drove away into the early evening while Maya stood in the parking lot watching the taillights disappear, holding her hand up to watch the ring catch the fading light. She went inside the diner one more time, found her old regular Tommy still working the grill, despite 5 more years of age and wear, and ordered coffee and toast, wheat, no butter, sitting in the same spot at the counter where James used to sit every Tuesday morning. The coffee tasted exactly like she remembered, slightly burnt and bitter, but she drank it anyway while thinking about the strange paths life took, the random encounters that changed everything, the importance of seeing people rather than just circumstances. When she left, she put a $100 bill under her coffee cup and walked out into her transformed life, carrying James's gift forward into whatever came next.